Hello everyone, this is Andrew and welcome to my first full fish room update video. I currently have 6 active tanks with 3 kinds of fish, 2 kinds of shrimps, 4 types of snails, and a gazillion types of plants. So let's get started. First off, of course, we have my 125-gallon tank. I originally bought this from some guy back in the 90s who was keeping an arowana in it. I think I paid $300 back then for both the tank and the stand, which has proven to be a pretty good deal for all the enjoyment it's brought us over the last years. For the first 23 years, this tank was the home to a variety of saltwater fish. Then for 4 years, it was the home to 3 gorgeous red and white goldfish. Then for the last 5 years, it was the home for several Ranchu goldfish. And now, as you can see, it's the home to 10 beautiful Bozeman-eye rainbowfish. I had originally ordered 9 of them from Aquatic Arts here in Indianapolis, and it gave me 8 blue and orange males and 1 very green female. So I eventually went to our local fish store, the Reef, and bought 3 females, which I plan to quarantine in a 40-gallon tank for a month. Unfortunately, the alpha female killed off one of the females after a few days, and then she killed off the other one a few days later. So here she is being added after her month-long quarantine was up. The other fish didn't seem overly interested in her at first, and she quickly became a part of the school. Since we've been calling the female Bozeman in here Lady Green, we ended up calling the new female Killer Green. Rainbowfish males, as you can see, show off amazing colors when they are courting females or dueling with each other. I had considered getting these 11 years ago when I switched this tank over to freshwater, but decided on the goldfish instead. Now that I have 6 tanks going, I finally get to keep both goldfish and rainbowfish, as well as all the shrimps and plants that you can't really keep with the goldies. This tank has 3 different types of strata. There's about an inch of organic compost at the bottom, then a layer of fluval stratum, which are a type of clay ball, and then a layer of equal-complete lava rocks on top. Plus there's a little bit of colored gravel mixed in for some color variety. I went with a couple types of shorter chaining plants and pearlweed in the front, some crypts and a dwarf lily for the middle, and some taller plants like jungle valves and water sprite for the back. I decided not to do any large hardscape for this tank, but I've tried to make a bit of a line-of-sight blocking wall with the plants in the middle. So far there hasn't been any kind of serious chasing around with the males, in part because there are so many. Hopefully that will continue. This tank is also home to around 30 amount of shrimp, which is probably a bit too much. And we have a lot of ram's horn snails. I had kept nearite snails when I had the goldfish in here, but I didn't want their eggs getting on the plants, and I wanted a snail that could reproduce in the tank so I wouldn't have to keep buying replacements. And they certainly do reproduce quite well. I need to periodically use my handy-dandy snail catcher when they get to be a bit too many. And I will sometimes squish a few in the water and let the rainbows eat them. So I kind of have an endless source of live food for the rainbows living in the tank. The only real problem I've had with this tank since I redid it has been the reappearance of the staghorn algae. I got this horrible algae a few years back when I ordered a different kind of floating plant from somewhere, and what a pain it has been ever since. Sadly, the amount of shrimp and ram's horns don't seem to eat it at all, so it's going to be a long-term issue, I'm afraid. But other than that, this tank has been really awesome. I'm using the Fluval lights with their timer app, so I get a nice 30-minute gradual increase in light in the afternoon and a nice 30-minute sunset in the evening. I then keep the lights on for 30 minutes with just 2% power for a very nice moonlight effect before lights go out. I've been feeding the rainbows frozen brine shrimp as their main food. I've also been giving them frozen mysis shrimp, flake food, small pellet food, and occasionally some live baby brine shrimps. A couple times a week I will blanch some broccoli, zucchini, or spinach to feed to the shrimp and snails, and occasionally drop a few algae wafers in. At least once a week I'll take the shells off some peas and add them in as well. The rainbows will actually eat some of the peas. Every other week I've been making some rapashi as well. Once I start seeing some breeding behavior, I will probably get a breeding mop and see how hard raising rainbowfish babies will be. Next we have my 30-gallon fully planted tank. This has turned out very well, and I could spend a lot of time just watching it. There's a full 2-inch layer of dirt at the bottom, a lot of clay balls over that, and a top layer of lava rocks. I have 14 beautiful Pseudomugil luminatus, or blue-eye rainbowfish. As you can see, I have a colony of red cherry shrimp as well. and boy have I learned to love these little guys. The cherry shrimps have been breeding since I got them, and several babies have survived long enough to get too big for the pseudos to eat them. I really love how the rock pile turned out. I keep a small piece of Indian almond leaf next to it, which the shrimps and snails really seem to enjoy. There are ram's horn snails in here and one tiny nearite snail that I was afraid would have been eaten by the goldfish. I need to periodically catch a lot of the baby ram's horns out of this tank though, since apparently it's a perfect environment for them to breed in. This tank is home to an amazing tiny world of things like small white worms and copepods. I can zoom in with my iPhone and watch them doing their thing a few lava rocks down in the front. Anything that spends too much time up in the water now though gets eaten by the fish. This tank has several different kinds of plants. The big one is a tiger lotus, which is a little bit different from the dwarf lily in the main tank. Its leaves ended up with a lot of holes, but I think it looks kind of cool to be honest. And there is a lot of vowels, some dwarf chain grass, and water wisteria. This tank also works great as a duckweed growing tank. About every day, I take a scoopful out and feed it to the goldfish in the other tanks. It's very convenient. So far, I've been feeding the fish in here baby brine shrimp every week. I supplement that with some decapsulated brine shrimp and flake food. I do sometimes put in a few of the frozen adult brine shrimp, which they eventually tear apart enough to eat. And of course, I feed the tank the same blanched vegetables, peas, and rapashi that I do the main tank. I have to say, this tank has really made me fall in love with raising cherry shrimp. Although I do spend a lot of time looking at them zoomed in with either my iPhone or a magnifying glass because they are pretty small, especially the babies. I post a lot of short videos of this tank on my Instagram account in case anyone is interested in seeing more. So this is my 40-gallon sand tank. I have an inch of dirt on the bottom on the far left side with a 2-inch sand cap above and some lava rocks on top. There are 2 pieces of driftwood keeping this section separate from the 1-inch or so layer in the rest of the tank. This is where I was raising my baby ranchus before I moved them to the 10-gallon so I could quarantine the 3 female bozeman's. I had hoped the thick guppy grass and Brazilian pennywort would have been enough for the females to have a place to keep away from each other, but I guess it sadly wasn't enough. I suspect if I hadn't quarantined them and just put them in together in the 125 with the other fish, they'd all still be alive. But I wasn't going to endanger the 9 bozeman's I already had by adding in unquarantined fish. After the rainbow's quarantine was over, I finally put 2 of my 6-year-old ranchus in the tank so they could discover the joys of sand. These are the 2 males that we usually just call the boys since they've always been together. There is one Amazon sword in here that has been pretty slow growing, and there are some sage and dwarf vowels and a water wisteria in here that I moved from the 30-gallon planted tank. I just moved the ranchus in, so I'm not sure how well any of the stem plants will hold up to the big boys swimming around and trying to eat them over time. The sand in here is the Supernaturals brand. I'm still up in the air if I want to keep a sand layer on top. I really can't vacuum this stuff at all without sucking up some sand, and I have to make sure I never get any of the sand in my plumbing. I'm not sure how nice the sand will look after a few weeks of goldfish pooping all over it, so we'll see. This tank has both ram's horn and nearite snails. When the goldfish have been in the tank long enough, of course, you don't have to worry about removing any unwanted baby snails. That's one of the benefits of having goldfish. This tank also has some trumpet snails. I found one in one of my plant orders and decided to leave it. They are pretty cool to watch moving through the sand. I wondered at the time if I would later regret keeping them. So far, so good. They kind of remind me of the larva form of Mothra from the Godzilla movies. Next, we have my obviously named Anubias tank. This is where all 4 of my 6-year-old ranchus have been living for the last few months. I've only been feeding them once a day and doing about 75% water changes every 2 weeks, and they seem to have been doing just fine. The other tanks get about a 25% water change every 2 to 3 weeks. I find that I really prefer having the awkward swimming ranchus in a more shallow tank, like this 40-gallon, rather than the much taller 125. The round white ranchu is Moby, my 1 female. The other is Blue Eyes, who, should probably have been culled a long time ago. His back is pretty bent, he's missing a gill cover, so you can actually see the blood in his gills, which I think is actually pretty cool. These 2 lived in this tank together for 4 years before we discovered that Blue Eyes was actually a male, who was just a bit slow to mature. Yes, after 4 years, we out of the blue suddenly had baby Ranchus born in here. It was quite a surprise. This tank has some floating hornwort that I got with one of my fish orders, and guppy grass and frogbit. It gets some direct sunlight from the window, which seems to actually keep unwanted algae from growing. This tank has most of my remaining nerite snails, some of which are very old now, as well as some ram's horns and a few surviving pond snails. Next to this, I have my newly set up 10-gallon and 2.5-gallon tanks. I got the 2.5-gallon as a nursery for any future Ranchus or Rainbowfish babies. I put one of the pregnant cherry shrimps in here a few weeks back, so now there are a whole bunch of tiny baby shrimps. My goldfish also made a few more babies before I moved them to the new tanks, so for now there are a couple of small Ranchu babies growing up here with the shrimps. This tank has a small rock pile, some Indian almond leaf, a small piece of driftwood with a baby anubias on it. All these tanks in the fish room have the double sponge filters, except for this one, it has a smaller type. My two third-generation Ranchus, Goldie and Dreamy, are growing up in the 10-gallon tank for now. At some point, the plan is to have 3 Ranchus in the sand tank and 3 in the anubias tank. And I plan to periodically switch them between the two tanks, but I think I'm going to wait until they're a little bit bigger before I put them in. So that's the current status of my 6 active aquariums. Thanks everyone for watching. I am Andrew, and as always, happy fish keeping.